Get ready for the myth behind the movie. This is the real story of the Odyssey, an epic Greek poem attributed to the ancient writer Homer and now the basis of a Christopher Nolan film. What's its plot? Why did some guy called Homer probably not write it, despite what you may have heard? Did any of it really happen? How has the text survived its own odyssey across the millennia to make it to us? And why are some of the casting, costume, and even language choices in Nolan's movie receiving backlash on account of their historical inaccuracies? Let's dig into the history, the film, and the controversies. Part 1. Plot Summary. I'm going to start with a summary of the Odyssey. Now, at the time of making this video, I don't know how closely the plot of the movie follows the written text, but if you want to skip this section just in case of spoilers, I'll put timestamps on the video to enable you to jump ahead. Also, I'm going to do my best with the pronunciations of Greek names and places here, of which there are going to be a lot in this video, but apologies to Greece if I mess anything up. The Odyssey, which is divided into 24 books and runs to 12,000 lines of poetry, tells the story of the journey home after the Trojan War of the Greek hero Odysseus, king of Ithaca. His name inspired the poem's title, Odyssey, and he is actually called Ulysses in Greek, but the Roman pronunciation of Odysseus seems to be more popular and is what is being used for the movie, so it's what I'm using here. The Trojan War lasted 10 years and is recounted in Homer's other great work, the Iliad, but the Odyssey does not start with the conflict's end. Instead, it opens many years later. Odysseus remains missing and most people believe he is dead. In his kingdom of Ithaca, his wife Penelope struggles to maintain control of the household while dozens of arrogant suitors live in the palace, consuming the family's wealth and demanding that she marry one of them. These men assume Odysseus will never return. Penelope, however, remains faithful to her husband and has been holding the men at bay for 7 years by using clever tricks. One of her most famous deceptions is promising to choose a husband after she finishes weaving a funeral shroud for Odysseus' father, Laertes, only to secretly unravel the work each night. Meanwhile, Odysseus' son, Telemachus, has grown up without his father. Though still young and inexperienced, he becomes increasingly frustrated by the suitors' disrespect and longs to discover what happened to Odysseus. The goddess Athena, who admires Odysseus for his intelligence and cunning, decides to help Telemachus. Disguised as a family friend called Mentes, she encourages him to search for news of his father. Telemachus travels to the kingdoms of several Greek heroes who fought in Troy, including King Nestor of Pylos and King Menelaus of Sparta, hoping to learn whether Odysseus is alive. Athena accompanies him, now disguised as Mentor, a friend of his father's. While Telemachus journeys abroad, the poem shifts focus to Odysseus himself. He has been trapped for years on the island of the nymph Calypso, who has fallen in love with him and wishes him to remain with her forever. Although Calypso offers immortality, Odysseus longs to return home to Penelope and Ithaca. The gods eventually intervene. Athena persuades Zeus to order Calypso to release Odysseus, and reluctantly she helps him build a raft so he can continue his voyage. Odysseus' troubles are far from over. The sea god Poseidon hates him because Odysseus blinded Poseidon's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. Poseidon sends a violent storm that destroys Odysseus' raft after 17 days and nearly kills him. Exhausted, alone, naked, and injured, Odysseus eventually washes ashore on the island of the Phaeacians, where he is discovered by the princess Nausicaa. The Phaeacians treat him with kindness and hospitality, and while at their court they have their blind bard Demodocus sing the history of a quarrel Odysseus had with Achilles in the Iliad about the famous Trojan horse that helped the Greeks to take the city. This moves Odysseus to tears, and after an athletics exhibition in which he has to show his great strength, he eventually reveals his identity and recounts the adventures that have delayed his return home. These stories form the central portion of the epic. After leaving Troy with 12 ships, Odysseus and his men first raid the land of the Caucones, a Thracian tribe, but their greed and recklessness lead to heavy losses. They then encounter the Lotus Eaters, whose magical fruit causes forgetfulness and destroys the desire to return home. Odysseus forces his affected men back onto the ships before they can abandon their journey entirely. The travellers next arrive at the land of the Cyclops, giant one-eyed creatures who live without laws or civilization. Odysseus and his crew enter the cave of Polyphemus, this is Poseidon's son, hoping to receive hospitality, but instead the Cyclops traps them inside and begins eating the men alive. Odysseus devises a clever escape. He tells Polyphemus that his name is Nobody, then blinds the Cyclops with a sharpened stake while he sleeps. When Polyphemus cries out that nobody is attacking him, the other Cyclops ignore his pleas. Odysseus and his surviving men escape by hiding beneath sheep as they leave the cave. However, Odysseus's pride causes him to reveal his true name while sailing away, allowing Polyphemus to pray to Poseidon for revenge. As we've already heard, this moment then becomes the source of many future hardships. Odysseus later receives a bag of winds, except the west wind, from the god Aeolus, so that the Greeks can sail safely home. Ithaca comes into sight, but while Odysseus sleeps, his suspicious crew opens the bag, believing it contains treasure. The released winds blow them far off course, ruining their chance to return home, and thus the adventure continues. The crew next encounters the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals who destroy almost all of Odysseus' ships and devour many of his men. Only Odysseus' own ship survives. Soon afterward, the survivors arrive on the island of the enchantress Circe. She transforms several crew members into pigs and takes Odysseus as her lover. But a year later, knowing that he wants to leave her, Circe instructs Odysseus to travel to the Underworld to seek guidance from the blind prophet Tiresias. In the land of the dead, Odysseus encounters the spirits of fallen heroes and loved ones, including his mother who died during his absence. Tiresias warns him not to harm the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios and predicts that Odysseus will eventually return home alone after losing all his men. After leaving the underworld, Odysseus and his crew face the sirens, whose beautiful songs lure sailors to destruction. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus plugs his crew's ears with wax and has himself tied to the mast so that he can hear the song safely without steering the ship towards disaster. The travellers then confront two terrifying sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla is a six-headed creature who snatches sailors from passing ships, while Charybdis creates a deadly whirlpool capable of swallowing entire vessels. Odysseus chooses to sail closer to Scylla, sacrificing a few men rather than risking total destruction in Charybdis' whirlpool. Eventually, Odysseus' crew land on the island of Helios. Despite repeated warnings not to touch the sacred cattle, the starving men slaughter and eat them while Odysseus sleeps. As punishment, Zeus destroys the ship with a thunderbolt. Every crew member dies except Odysseus, who drifts alone across the sea for 9 days until he reaches Calypso's island, where he remains trapped for years. Again, this goes back to information given earlier in the poem. After hearing Odysseus' tale, the Phaeacians agree to help him return to Ithaca. They transport him home while he sleeps, finally ending his 20-year absence. However, Ithaca is no longer peaceful thanks to the machinations of the suitors. Athena appears and disguises Odysseus as an old beggar so he can secretly observe the situation, and Telemachus returns home and is reunited with his father, who is only recognised by a few other loyal servants. One of the most emotional moments in the poem occurs when Odysseus' old dog, Argos, recognises his master after years of waiting and dies shortly afterward. Odysseus sees the cruelty and arrogance of the suitors, while Penelope announces a contest. She will marry the man who can string Odysseus' great bow and shoot an arrow through a row of 12 axe heads. None of the suitors can even string the bow. The disguised Odysseus easily accomplishes the feat, then reveals his true identity. Odysseus, Telemachus, and some other loyal servants slaughter the suitors and some of the disloyal servants who aided them. Even after the battle, Penelope remains cautious. She tests Odysseus by mentioning their marriage bed, which Odysseus himself built around a living olive tree and therefore it cannot be moved. When Odysseus reacts with outrage at the suggestion that the bed has been moved, Penelope finally accepts that he is truly her husband. The poem concludes with Odysseus reclaiming his kingdom and restoring order to Ithaca. Athena intervenes one final time to prevent further violence between Odysseus and the families of the slain suitors, and peace is restored. The end. Part 2. Homer. Man or myth? The question of who wrote the Odyssey is one fraught by varying theories and a lack of solid information. Tradition ascribes it to the ancient writer Homer, but we can't trace his association with either it, or the Iliad for that matter, any further back than about 520 BC, when a man called Hipparchus had them read at the Great Panathenea at Athens. This is a problem because both poems are traditionally dated to the late 8th or early 7th centuries BC, at least 150 years earlier, and the earliest reference we have to Homer himself also dates to the 7th century BC. There's therefore a serious gap during which time we don't know who was considered the author of the poems, if indeed anyone at all was. Perhaps they were originally anonymous. Then there's the issue of whether Homer was even a real person. Heck, some people wonder if he was even a guy, or if the Iliad and Odyssey were written by a woman. There are no contemporary sources for his life beyond these poems and a few other writings ascribed to him, and all of the ancient biographies of him date to hundreds of years after he supposedly lived and died. By the second half of the 6th century BC, there was a company of rhapsodes, meaning people who recited poems, known as the Homeridae, who believed they were descended from Homer and who performed poems they claimed to be his. There is no evidence that they were actually connected to a real ancestor of that name, however, and they even invented poems which they attributed to him. Moving forward another few hundred years, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who lived from roughly 276 BC to 194 BC, said that Homer was born soon after the sack of Troy, which he claimed happened in the year 1183 BC. Now, Eratosthenes was looking back a whopping 907 years before his own estimated birth year here, but he was a clever cookie who calculated the circumference of the earth and became the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria. So if anyone could work out a date for a war we aren't sure happened and a birthday for a man who might well be fictional, it was probably him. Still, bear in mind that the various dates for the Trojan War range from 910 BC to 1334 BC. In other words, we really don't have a clue when it occurred, if any such conflict happened at all, and even if, hypothetically, this broad date range did encompass some war that became the basis for the stories, it still dates to at least 2 centuries before the Odyssey was written down. The biographies of Homer also provide very different accounts of his life, further undermining their claim to be about the same man and a real person. I only have time to tell you a little of the information they contain, but as a result of their disagreements, 7 different cities have claimed to be his birthplace: Chios, Smyrna, Colophon, Salamis, Rhodes, Argos, and Athens. The island of Kos claims to be his burial location, though Cyprus disagrees, claiming him as one of their own and the son of a Cypriot woman called Thermisto. Look in the work of an ancient author known as Pseudo-Herodotus, and you'll read that his mother was instead called Cretheus, that he was born out of wedlock in Smyrna 168 years after the sack of Troy, and that he was blind, though seemingly not from birth, a detail some other writers have picked up on as well. Apparently he was originally called Melesianes, and he travelled far and wide and began to make up poems on his travels, much to the delight of his companions. He changed his name to Homer in Cimeris, and it, Homer, means either blind or hostage, though M.L. West, writing in the Classical Quarterly in 1999, said that in fact it did not mean blind, noting that there is no supporting evidence for the existence of such a word, and adding that, while blind may serve as a cognomen, no one is given it as a self-sufficient name. West also notes that the fact that the name Homer is not a regular Greek name at all throws further doubts on whether the man truly existed. Some say he died of illness, others of shame, and on the island of Ios, when he was unable to solve a child's riddle. In short, there is no conclusive evidence that Homer was a real person, or when or where he lived. The many stories concerning his supposed life are almost as fantastical as some of the works attributed to him, and Pseudo-Herodotus had a suspicious habit of including tales and characters which mimicked some of those found in the Odyssey, such as that blind bard Demodocus that I already mentioned. Part 3. The Odyssey's Provenance and Transmission. Given the serious question marks over the existence of Homer as an individual, the prevailing sentiment amongst historians today is that the Odyssey was not constructed by one person. The The style of the original Greek in which it is composed does at least suggest that it originated on the west coast of Turkey, close to cities like Chios, Smyrna and Colophon, and perhaps that is why stories of Homer being from one of those places took hold. How did it get from antiquity to us, though? Well, the date range for the emergence of the Odyssey in the 7th or 8th centuries BC is only an estimate, and it is entirely possible that it and the Iliad grew out of older stories and/or had been circulating for some time, having been passed down orally by bards who had to commit them to memory. Think of those rhapsodes I mentioned earlier. This process, which could have been going on for centuries and which continued for centuries more, inevitably led to changes in the stories as they passed through different people and their fallible human memories, never mind deliberate changes to jazz up the narrative a little or make the story resonate more with a particular audience living in a particular place, in a particular time, and experiencing a particular political, social, or economic situation. Indeed, there is a huge question mark over whether the same person or persons even wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey because of stylistic differences. Let's stay focused on the Odyssey, though. The earliest surviving written record of it dates to the 3rd century BC, and if we look at a papyrus fragment of the epic dating to circa 285 to 250 BC, now held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we see that, to quote the museum's website, it contains 3 lines from Book 20 that do not occur in the standard text preserved today and is a physical testimony to the fact that local variations of this famous work existed in the 3rd century BC. In other words, what we read today could be the product of literally hundreds of authors across several centuries, all adding, subtracting, or tweaking little pieces of the text before it finally became standardized in the written word, and even that took multiple attempts, as the Met's papyrus fragment with its extra lines shows. Little wonder that Alberto Manguel muses in his 2024 book, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, a biography, that it may be that Homer was born not as a man, but as a symbol, as the name that the ancient bards gave to their own art, turning a timeless activity into a legendary primordial person, into a celebrated common ancestor of all poets, the first and the best. Elsewhere, in a blog entry on the British Museum's website, Daisy Dunn wonders, should we think of Homer as a sort of editor who shaped the inherited material into the complete poems? The Odyssey was also translated in antiquity, appearing in Latin in the 3rd century BC, having been translated by Livius Andronicus, and it continued to be translated into many other languages as the centuries and millennia wore on. The first English version did not appear until 1616 though, and was created by George Chapman. Part 4. Did any of this really happen? If we aren't sure that Homer was real or wrote the Odyssey, we are equally shaky on whether parts of it were inspired by real events, though at least some of it was certainly based on genuine geography. Now, of course, tales of ancient gods, goddesses, sirens, and nymphs can be discounted. I hope I haven't burst anyone's bubble there. But the question of whether Troy and its famous war might be based on some real city and conflict are harder to disprove entirely, and some of the geography mentioned in the Odyssey is certainly true. One popular theory holds that Troy was indeed an actual city and was located in modern-day Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, a place which archaeologists have shown was home to 9 different cities over the millennia, including one known as Troy 7, which was in existence at the correct time to sync up with the supposed Trojan War if it actually did occur in the 1180s BC. The association between Troy and Hisarlik is so strong, in fact, that UNESCO identifies the ruins as the archaeological site of Troy. When it comes to discussing the reality of other places mentioned by Homer, whatever or whomever Homer was, we are on more solid ground. Odysseus' kingdom is a real island, though admittedly whether the island of that name today is the same one mentioned in the poem is open to debate. Sparta was a genuine city in the ancient world, and Pylos, Crete and Egypt are all real too. So one theory is that at least some of the stories in the Odyssey are based, however loosely, on real historical events and places. However, I don't think we'll ever be able to pick apart fiction and reality. Too much time has passed, and the sources we'd need simply don't exist. My personal view on how the Odyssey and the Iliad might sit in relation to real history is that, at best, assuming there are some shards of reality mixed in with all the mythical creatures and magical goings-on, these two epic poems are to real Greek history what Game of Thrones is to the 15th century Wars of the Roses. There are clear parallels between real events and places in history and George R.R. Martin's books because he used the wars as his inspiration, but Game of Thrones was written 500 plus years after the actual wars and includes dragons, witches, White Walkers, zombies and other types of magic, just as the Iliad and Odyssey would have to post-date Troy 7 by centuries and have their own cast of impossible creatures and locations, like the Underworld. Imagine that people 3,000 years from now only had the Game of Thrones saga available to them to try to make sense of 15th century English, Scottish and French history, because the Wars of the Roses spilled into each of those countries. What if they were left trying to connect maps of Westeros and Essos to the real British Isles and France? Think how impossible it would be to match up the geographies with any certainty, or to connect the stories of Henry Tudor and Daenerys Targaryen. For my part, I refuse to even worry about whether there are fragments of reality in the Odyssey or its predecessor, the Iliad. I'm happy to just take them as works of fiction set partly in the real world and not hurt my brain trying to undertake the impossible task of connecting them to reality any further than that with any certainty. Unless you're a die-hard ancient historian or archaeologist, I suggest you do the same. Part 5. The 2026 movie. Now we come to Christopher Nolan's film The Odyssey, released in 2026. This could be viewed as something of a sequel to the 2004 movie Troy, which, as the name suggests, told the story of the Trojan War and starred Brad Pitt. But even before its release, it was garnering considerable backlash due to its perceived historical inaccuracies. First, there is the casting. The story is based on a famous Greek epic poem and set in the ancient Greek world. Yet the cast, while very internationally diverse, with major stars from America, England, South Africa and Kenya, has barely any connection to Greece. I think there's one supporting cast member, Michael Vlamis, who I believe is part Greek, and that's it. This left a bitter taste in the mouths of many, with accusations of erasing Greek culture. The Greek City Times wrote an open letter to the cast and creative team behind the movie, which I'll quote some of here and leave linked below for you so that you can read the whole thing. I thought it was very well written, kind and balanced. Among other things, the letter says, "Consider something that is often overlooked in modern retellings of Greek stories. Greek people did not disappear after the age of myth. Greek culture was not frozen in classical marble. Greek language was not extinguished in antiquity. We are still here. Greek is still spoken today, the oldest continuously surviving language in Europe, not reconstructed, not revived, but lived. That continuity matters when stories like the Odyssey are retold. Odysseus is not only a universal symbol of endurance, struggle, and homecoming. He is also part of a cultural inheritance that has been carried through every one of those historical layers, meaning various historical eras. That is why conversations about representation matter deeply to us. We are not asking for exclusion or limitation. We are not arguing against diversity nor against reinterpretation. Greek culture itself has always been shaped by exchange, migration, and encounter across centuries. What we are asking is something simpler and more human, that when Greek stories are retold on a global stage, Greek people are not rendered invisible within them. In discussions around the Odyssey, some have argued that mythology belongs to the world and should not be bound by cultural origin. Others see casting diversity as a reflection of the modern global audience rather than historical specificity. We understand those perspectives, but universality does not require disconnection from origin. The letter then has an addendum at the bottom which reads, "Given Hollywood's and the Academy of Motion Picture Art and Sciences rules and insistence for minority representations, authenticity and diversity, where are the Greeks or the Greek Americans in this Greek story?" There is then a list of the main actors in the movie with their ethnic backgrounds, and none of them are even part Greek. Now, I take their points, and I think a lot of this hurt and anger and criticism could have been avoided by the inclusion of some other actors who are still big names, because that's what Nolan seems to want, and I understand that well-known figures help to get viewers into cinemas, but who are either Greek or have a good strong dose of Greek heritage in them, just as the addendum to the letter mentions. Think of people like Jennifer Aniston, whose dad was from Crete, or Theo James and Zach Galifianakis, who are also part Greek. I'm not saying the whole cast had to be Greek. I actually think it's very limiting to say that only actors from particular countries can play characters from those same countries, but it would have been a nice, respectful nod to Greece to have a stronger connection amongst the cast to that country and dulled some of the criticisms. So that's the general complaint about a dire lack of Greek representation in a movie about a Greek story set in the ancient Greek world. There are also some very specific complaints about certain pieces of casting. Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy, and her sister, though they aren't twins, has attracted particular anger in some quarters. For instance, Helen of Troy, known as the face that launched 1,000 ships, was the woman whose kidnap by the Trojan prince Paris from her husband Menelaus of Sparta started the Trojan War. The criticisms of the casting come down to the fact that Miss Nyong'o is black and therefore her appearance is not in line with a woman of this character's social and geographical background. By the way, I can only assume that Zendaya is not receiving the same level of backlash because she's playing the goddess Athena and therefore not human, so that character can look like anyone. The complaints about Nyong'o reflect the ongoing controversy around colourblind casting, a practice which has become popular over the last few years and which shows no sign of abating. I discussed this in more detail in my video all about whether Queen Charlotte of the United Kingdom was black, as she is portrayed in the Bridgerton TV show, so I'll just summarise my position here. I don't like it for real historical figures, as I like my history to be accurate. Hardly surprising, I think, given that I'm an historian. And I think that when people see something on screen, they often take it as gospel, and it can then be hard to dislodge that information from their heads. Just look at the sometimes crazed comments under that Queen Charlotte video of mine and another I made about her by people having a meltdown because I said she was a white European woman, gave numerous pieces of primary source evidence to support my view, and showed that the theory she was biracial was based on a pseudo-historian's fantasy and lousy research. Once you put a lie into people's heads that they want to be true, though, exposure to the real truth can trigger something like an allergic reaction in some of them, and that is why I like my historical TV shows and movies to stick to the known facts as far as the evidence will allow. Now, I personally am more flexible about colourblind casting when it comes to fictional characters, partly because I sympathise with actors of colour who already have fewer roles available to them in Hollywood and would have even fewer if there was never any such flexibility. Don't get me wrong, even when a fictional TV show or movie is set in a real historical time and place and employs colourblind casting, it can still break or partially break my immersion in the story, but that's just me, and I'm prepared to do my best to look past it for the reasons I just mentioned. I'm not saying that you have to feel the same way. However, I do prefer it and find it less jarring if it's established that we're looking at an alternate reality, and I think it can take the wind out of the sails of many critics. For instance, Bridgerton is actually set in an alternate version of 19th century England, where a black Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz married King George III and thus opened up the British aristocracy to non-white people. This is specifically mentioned in the first season and helps me at least to suspend my disbelief and just enjoy the show. A lot of movies and shows don't go this alternate reality route though for their fictional stories, and I understand why some people just can't get past it. Everyone is different. On a little side note, something to ponder is why colourblind casting is so controversial, but age-blind casting rarely is. The casting of a black man to play Severus Snape in the Harry Potter TV show, for instance, has angered a lot of people, even though it's a totally invented character. But I don't think anyone ever cared that Alan Rickman was 54 when production began on the first movie, making him far too old to be playing a man who was meant to be between his early and late 30s across the entire run of the books. Just something to think about. A movie like The Odyssey is a bit of a grey area for a person like me because I believe its story and that of its predecessor, the Iliad, to be either mostly or entirely fictional. But as we've seen, despite their many fantastical elements, they appear to be largely set in the real world. Unlike Game of Thrones, the story of Odysseus' life is tied a lot more closely to real Earth geography by the mention of places like Sparta, Crete and Ithaca. I can therefore understand the complaint here. Helen is meant to be a queen from the ancient Greek world. She wouldn't have had Miss Nyong'o's skin colour, and unlike German actress Diane Kruger, who played the same role in the movie Troy, anyone with even a vague understanding of European history of that era knows that there's no way that someone who looks like Miss Nyong'o could be a Greek queen from 3,000 years ago. She's beautiful and an excellent actress, but she's simply from the wrong ethnic group to hold that social position in that time and place. It would be like casting Miss Kruger to play a woman from ancient Kenyan history or mythology. We all know that such a person wouldn't have looked remotely like her. Ms. Nyong'o has responded to the criticisms of her casting, saying that, and this is slightly edited, "This is a mythological story. I'm very supportive of Chris's intention with it and with the version of this story that he is telling. Our cast is representative of the world. I'm not spending my time thinking of a defense. The criticism will exist whether I engage with it or not." I think she's quite right on that point, by the way. She went on to add that it's quite something to be a part of the Odyssey because it is so grand. It spans worlds. So that's why the cast is what it is. We're occupying the epic narrative of our time. That response is going to be fine with some, but others, like the authors of the open letter in the Greek City Times, are going to make the counter-argument that I've already discussed for you, that though some think that, quote, mythology belongs to the world and should not be bound by cultural origin, universality does not require disconnection from origin. It's entirely up to you which you find more persuasive. I will say, though, as has been pointed out many times in debates about this issue, that if a character from even a fictional world who was written as not white was played by a white person, there would likely be loud complaints about it. So there does seem to be a double standard in Hollywood at the moment, something which could probably be addressed in large part if more content was made showcasing real and fictional black stories, and other skin colours too, I might add, rather than the current heavy imbalance towards white. Anyways, this issue is not something that would put me personally off going to see the movie. I'm just explaining that I understand why some, especially the Greek people, are put out by the Odyssey's casting. And honestly, if I was Greek, I can imagine being less forgiving of these casting decisions. It's all very well me saying that it won't dissuade me from watching the film, but I'm in the privileged position of not feeling directly affected by it. If it was a movie about Irish or British mythology, those are my ethnic backgrounds, and there was basically no Irish or British involvement in it, I think I'd struggle to feel represented by it, and in that case, it probably would deter me from going to see it, though I imagine many people from other countries wouldn't mind. Should we really let issues like this slide, though, just because they don't directly affect us? That seems like a slippery slope, does it not? Another casting choice, which has come in for some flack, albeit for very different reasons, is that of Elliot Page, who is transgender. This is based on the fact that Page is rumoured to have been cast in the role of the famous warrior Achilles, though at the time I'm recording this, that rumour hasn't been confirmed. The controversy here is basically that having been born female and never gone through male puberty, Page doesn't have the physique one would associate with the mythical Achilles, who has previously been played by actors including Brad Pitt, and that this takes the viewer out of the movie, breaking their immersion in the story. Having not seen the movie yet though, and with no confirmation of which role Page is playing, I really can't comment any further on that. Some have tried to claim that Nyong'o and Page's casting, and presumably this would have to include Zendaya too, was done to improve diversity quotas and make the film qualify for the Oscars. But in fact, the Academy Awards standards for diversity are much looser than such a claim would have you believe, and very easy to meet without casting black women and a trans man. According to Conor Murray, writing in Forbes on the 15th of May 2026, to be eligible for Best Picture at the Oscars, films must meet 2 of 4 diversity standards, and 3 of the 4 criteria can be met in multiple different ways. The first standard can be met through on-screen representation, either by having one lead or significant supporting actor or 30% of the entire cast from an underrepresented group, or by the film's main theme centering on an underrepresented group, including women, LGBTQ people, people of colour, or people with cognitive or physical disabilities. The second criteria can be met by having either 2 department heads, like cinematographers, directors, or costume designers, 6 crew members, or 30% of the entire crew from underrepresented groups. The third criteria can be met by the film studio or production company offering internships or training opportunities to people from underrepresented groups. The fourth standard can be met by having multiple executives from underrepresented groups in a film's development, marketing, publicity, or distribution teams. In short, I think we can jettison the idea that the Oscar-nominated Page, Oscar-winning Nyong'o, and Emmy and Golden Globe winner Zendaya were cast for Oscar diversity quotas. The evidence just isn't there, and there surely can be no doubt about these people's acting chops. Yet another casting choice, which seems strange to some, was the inclusion of American rapper Travis Scott. Nolan has defended Scott's inclusion by saying that it's a nod to the fact that the poem was originally handed down orally, which he says is analogous to rap. Make of that what you will, but I'm pretty sure the ancient bards weren't rapping the Odyssey. I wouldn't say that rap is transmitting history nowadays, though the silver screen is, and it seems like another instance when a Greek musician or poet of some kind could have been included instead as a much clearer and easily achievable nod towards actual Greek culture. There were also criticisms of the dialogue used in the movie, such as the word dad. The decision to write the script in this way may be partly attributable to the fact that the translation Nolan used as the basis for his movie is by a woman called Professor Emily Wilson, who sought to modernise it and look at it through a feminist lens as well. No shade to her, by the way. She didn't ask Nolan to use her translation for his movie. He had many others available to him. She explains her decision as follows in an author's note. It may be tempting to imagine that a translation of a very ancient poem would be somehow better if it used the language of an earlier era. Mild stylistic archaism is often accepted without question in translations of ancient texts and can be presented as if it were a mark of authenticity. But of course, the English of the 19th or early 20th century is no closer to Homeric Greek than the language of today. Now, she's correct. Translating ancient Greek into slightly outdated English doesn't make the translation any more accurate, and the ancients who heard this story heard it in their modern, at that time, vernacular. As the language didn't sound old to them, what's the benefit in it sounding old to us? We can see this argument play out in the treatment of other ancient texts too. What we consider old-fashioned translations of the Bible, done in the 16th century, were written in what was then modern language, with the intention being that the common, literate person would be able to read it with ease. Nowadays, though, it is difficult for many people to engage with a text written in the language of 500 years ago, and so there are modern translations which use more modern words and phrasing to help keep the text current and accessible. Despite all this, when dealing with on-screen retellings of a story rather than a written version, for some reason I, and I suspect many others, prefer the language to sound older, and it seems odd to me to hear modern parlance in such a context. The only explanation I can think of is that when I'm seeing visuals which look old, like people in costumes which don't resemble modern clothing, in a location which looks like it's from hundreds or even thousands of years ago, I expect to hear audio which sounds old too, even if it doesn't match the language or time period I'm looking at. If I was watching a movie about Jesus and saw the actor playing him dressed like it was the year 31 AD, but then he turned around to his disciples and said, "Okay boys, let me tell you the totally cool story of how I was born in Bethlehem and why your man Joseph isn't actually my dad," it would be like nails down a chalkboard to me. It wouldn't match the visuals, and it would lack the gravitas that I expect from that kind of subject matter too. I think if you want to use modern language and you're not making a comedy, then the best thing to do is to adapt the story to the modern world, just as Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew was adapted to the 1999 movie 10 Things I Hate About You. Although, fun fact, they did still manage to include a few little shards of actual Shakespeare text. What about accents? The retention of American accents by the likes of Matt Damon and the use of American accents even by British actors like Robert Pattinson and Tom Holland has generated controversy too, though I think we could say that there is a logic in at least having everyone use the same accent for reasons of continuity. It would be annoying if Odysseus and his son had different accents despite being from the same place. Now, even an all-Greek cast speaking Greek wouldn't have ancient accents, so how can modern movie makers deal with that issue? Well, for some reason, people associate standard English accents, the kind that Pattinson and Holland naturally have, with period pieces, even when those period pieces aren't set in England. It makes no sense, really. Obviously, no ancient Greek would have spoken like this, not least because the English language didn't exist yet, but English-speaking audiences are more accepting of it than they are of American accents in historical movies and TV shows not set in that country. Perhaps it's because we all know that American English is so much younger than English English? I don't know, and people will have different takes on how much this matters. For me, I find an American accent in such a situation can be jarring for the first few minutes of a movie, and then I just stop noticing it. But I know that for others, it completely breaks the spell for them, and they can't see, or rather hear, past it. Now, despite modern Greeks not having ancient accents, nevertheless, if we wanted to be as accurate as possible, we'd have the movie acted in slightly archaic Greek, maybe Greek as it was spoken in the 18th century, to help the 21st century Greek audience hearing it feel like they're hearing older language, even if it's not old enough, and we'd have subtitles for other languages, which translated the dialogue into slightly archaic versions of those other languages. The second best option might be to have the international cast of actors speak English with Greek accents, but let's be serious for a minute. The movie is going to earn a huge portion of its money from English-speaking markets, especially the US, and those markets want to hear actors speaking in English, preferably in one of the native English accents, so that the audience's brains don't have to work as hard to understand what's being said. I can't think of a huge Hollywood blockbuster that was in a quote-unquote foreign language or had all or nearly all native English speakers in the main roles speaking with accents that suggested that that wasn't their first language. If Nolan had gone either of these alternative routes, I think there would have been huge criticism and mockery levelled at him in those cases too, and the movie would have done more poorly at the box office. I guess the moral of the story is, when doing a period piece set somewhere where English wasn't the first language, just get the actors to speak English with a classic English accent. For better or worse, that seems to be the most popular way to handle the situation, even though I readily admit that it defies logic. The costume department is not immune from criticism either. Why have authenticated Bronze Age pieces of armour and weaponry not been used as templates for those created for the film, some ask? Why are we instead seeing things like full plate armour, which is popping up around 2400 years before it was invented? As one funny comment I saw on X said, they might as well just fly in on helicopters. Now, I can't answer all of these questions, however, Nolan has defended the use of black armour for some characters, which has been hilariously compared to the Batman outfit online, perhaps because he directed one of those movies too, saying that there are Mycenaean daggers that are blackened bronze. The theory is they probably could have blackened bronze in those days. You take bronze, you add more gold and silver to it, and then use sulphur. With Agamemnon, Ellen, our costume designer, is trying to communicate how elevated he is relative to everyone else. You do that through materials that would be very expensive. At least there was some thought put into this, I guess, but inaccurate costumes are still something I don't personally like. It goes back to people mistaking Hollywood's version of history for the real thing. And I don't see why period-accurate clothing can't be made for such films. Also, I think if you're having other anachronistic features, like some of the casting and language that I've just mentioned, the rest of the movie or TV show really needs to be grounded in reality to help to offset that. As always though, that's just my opinion. Do feel free to disagree. So in my view, and again, please bear in mind that I haven't seen the movie yet, Hollywood is not doing a great job of representing the history associated with the Odyssey, though for all I know, Nolan may well still have created a very entertaining movie. I'm going to wrap up this pretty long video here, though I know there is much more that could be said about issues like the Odyssey's plot, provenance, the existence of Homer, and how Hollywood is dealing with this ancient text, but we can discuss such issues in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to give it a like and a hype and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on. For more from me, you can also join as a channel member to get members-only posts and badges next to your name in the comments, or find me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonuses every week, like early access to ad-free videos and patron-only podcasts. If you have Irish ancestry and are interested in researching your genealogy, you can also get a copy of my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, from Amazon as an ebook or paperback. It's linked below for you, as is Patreon. For free bonuses, join my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, to get 2 complimentary downloads right away, plus my monthly newsletter. Please remember to check that the welcome email you'll get upon sign-up doesn't go to your junk folder, and if it does, specify that mail from that sender is not spam so that the newsletter doesn't go the same way. Again, the link is below. Let me know in the comments if you're going to see the movie, or if you already have, what did you think of it? For more ancient history, try my video on the Library of Alexandria, or for stories of Hollywood versus history, see my videos on Anne Boleyn's execution, Pocahontas, or Queen Charlotte. Till next time all, keep learning.